If you have ever stood as a newcomer at the border between one country and another, about to enter it and to make your home in this new land, a foreign land, a land not your own, but a gifted land, filled with hope and the promise of a new life and a new future for your family, your children, and your children's children, then you will know something of the experience of the Israelites as they stood with their leader Moses on the banks of the Jordan River at the border. There is wonder there, but there is also fear, anxiety, hope, and excitement. The time has finally come for the Israelites to put the 40 years of wandering behind them, and they are impatient and eager to get to their new land. No longer will they be a landless people, sojourners in an environment that cannot support life and that offers no hope for the future. No longer will they be hungry and thirsty, dependent on their daily meal of manna to drop from the sky, for water to come from a rock. Soon, very soon, just as soon as they cross the Jordan River, the Israelites will become a people who will own their own land. This time, the snippet of it described in today's passage from Deuteronomy is the most decisive moment in Israel's history, as every transition moment is. And I think that in our world, we've been observing what has been happening on the border between Russia and Ukraine, hoping and praying that a different decision would have been made. Well, our family has stood in this place on the border between one country and another, filled with excitement, fear, and trepidation, when we moved from South Africa to Canada in the 1980s. It took 6 years for us to get the piece of paper with the 2 words we'd waited so long to see written on top of them: landed immigrant. We will never forget the moment the official standing at Pearson Airport uttered these words: "Welcome to Canada, your new home." Our experience of arriving as landed immigrants is not the experience that every displaced person or refugee in our world experiences. Many find no welcome and find themselves confined in places they do not wish to be. Well, there was no welcome to the promised land sign visible at the Jordan River that day either. But the same anticipation was in the people. Something new is about to begin for Israel. The old thing has passed away, and the new beginning will be in this land of promise. Chapter 8 in the book of Deuteronomy tells us this about the land. It will be a good land, a land of brooks and water, of fountains and springs, a land of valleys and hills, of wheat and barley, a land of olive trees and honey. It will be a land in which the people will lack nothing, a land whose stones are iron, and out of hills they can dig for copper. But before they enter this new land, before the landless wanderers become possessors of land, they must stop and wait and listen to their leader Moses, to hear what he has to say to them there on the border between landlessness and landedness. Now Moses has already received the law from Mount Sinai, and now the covenanter and the shaper of Israel speaks. And in his speaking, he defines the shape and the character of the new Israel, of Israel in this new land, and their relationship with the land and over the land as the people waiting to enter a new land. Moses' speech in the book of Deuteronomy is filled with promise and challenge and demand. And he speaks about the land they are about to enter using words like gift and covenant, temptation and faith. In today's text that Mary read for us, Moses speaks and the Israelites listen to him telling them how they will take over the nation of the Anakites, defeating them and dispossessing them of their land. These are challenging words for us to hear, especially as we think about the doctrine of discovery in our own land and how we as colonizers came and took possession of land that was already inhabited by the First Nations people of this land, and how indigenous peoples were moved into reserves that were not always good lands. If we take the verses we heard today on their own, we hear them in one particular way, that God will go before the people like a devouring fire, and that the Israelites will subdue the Anakites. But perhaps we need to put these words together with all the other words that Moses spoke to the waiting Israelites. And perhaps we hear something new in them. The theologian Walter Brueggemann, in his stunning book, The Land, Place of Gift, Promise, and Challenge in Biblical Faith, writes this about the land of promise that the Israelites were about to enter. The land to Israel is a gift. It is a gift from Yahweh, and it binds Israel in new ways to the giver. Israel was clear at this border place that it did not take the land by power, but because God had spoken a word and was acting to keep God's word. And we remember that promise of God to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, that they would be the fathers of many nations and have descendants as many as the grains of sand on the beach. Land, says Brueggemann, is different when it is given in speaking and received in listening. It is not simply an object to be taken and occupied and possessed. Rather, it is to enter into a new covenantal relationship between God, Israel, and the land, and to make promises together about how you will steward it. When something as magnificent as a new land is given to a people, much is expected of them in return. For Israel at the border, the gift will mean responsibility and accountability and care for the land and for their siblings in the land, and never to forget from whence they came and how they got there, and how they wandered 40 years in the wilderness. Jesus said, "Everyone to whom much is given, of him or her or they, much will be required." As God's faithful people today, we are standing on the border, on the boundary line between an old way of being as colonizers and a new thing that is underway in the Anglican Church of Canada with Sacred Circle. The border is an exciting place to be as this new thing comes into being. And we have the opportunity, as my Indigenous siblings say, to do something good, to walk in a good way together as we enter new covenant relationships with God, with our siblings, and in the land. I have seen with my own eyes how amazing new things happen when God's people work together in covenant relationships with one another. I want to tell you today that PWRDF is very much part of the new thing that is happening in our church at the border. There is not a person in the world that COVID-19 has not affected. But the lived reality on the ground is that many communities and peoples have been hit much harder by others by this virus, most particularly in the fifth wave when Omicron hit. In January of this year, some of the bishops in Northern Indigenous communities in Manitoba and Ontario heard about the struggles and the difficulties that their communities were having containing the spread of the virus because they did not have proper PPE supplies. Many other Indigenous communities were hard hit because of a shortage of the very basics required to sustain life, daily food. Bearskin Lake and Kingfisher Lake in northwestern Ontario were particularly hard hit. For many years, the Diocese of Algoma, where I serve, has had a close partnership with Bishop Lydia Mamakoweesh, who is the bishop in Mishamakoweesh. And she had made known to us some of the struggles in Kingfisher Lake. Well, word about the great needs spread quickly and eventually through the channels of the church found their way to PWRDF and Will Postma. One Friday afternoon in early January, Will called me and invited the Diocese of Algoma to partner with PWRDF by signing a gift agreement so that PWRDF could send $15,000 worth $15,000 to us so that we could find a way to get the needed food and PPE supplies to the communities most in need, Bearskin Lake and Kingfisher Lake. And I wanted to show you, and if Suzanne could share the PowerPoint that I sent to her, I want to show you some of what happened as a result. I love this quote by Frederick Buechner. The place where God calls you is the place where your deep joy meets the deep suffering in the world, the border place that I was speaking about earlier. So we could have the next slide, please. And the next one. PWRDF donated $15,000 for food to be sent to the community of Bearskin Lake and the parish of St. Paul's in Thunder Bay, and its rector, Archdeacon Deborah Kraft, immediately went to work and purchased $10,000 worth of food to be shipped, to be transported by truck to Bearskin Lake. And these are some of the images of the food supplies being loaded onto a truck and then driven up to Bearskin Lake. Could have the next slide and the next one. And here some of the goods are having arrived at Bearskin Lake. There was a delay of a few days in getting the goods all the way to Bearskin Lake because of the weather. But we hoped that they would arrive on the Monday, but because of the weather, they actually arrived on the Thursday. And the next slide, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And so individuals from Bearskin community were able to come to this huge warehouse and receive food packages through the generosity of PWRDF. The partnership worked because PWRDF were able to raise the funds, but they needed the people on the ground to purchase the groceries and to get them shipped up to the community. And the next slide. Archdeacon Deborah Kraft then went on to purchase $5,000 worth of PPE supply, which was sent to Kingfisher First Nation. And she wrote this email to me. On a very cold morning, I am happy to report that all the PPE for Kingfisher Lake First Nation went up north by an Air Bravo charter this morning, January the 28th, 2022. I am very grateful to PWRDF for providing $5,000 for the purchase of PPE, and on top of that, for paying for the Air Bravo charter flight. And then, in turn, Titus Semple of Semple Enterprises donated an additional $6,000 worth of PPE supply for a total of $11,000 worth in donations. And when the home hardware store in Thunder Bay heard about this incredible generosity from PWRDF and Titus Semple, they gave $5,000 worth of gift cards for people to come and purchase heating equipment. All of this happened in under a week. Next slide, please. Here is a photograph of Archdeacon Deborah Kraft standing with Titus Temple, about to load the PPE supplies. And the next photo with the pilot of Air Bravo. And the last photo, the PPE supplies being put into this tiny little aircraft in January. Thank you. The great theologian and writer Frederick Buechner says, the place where God calls you and me is the place where your deep joy meets the suffering of the world. In these words, Buechner is not only naming the dynamic that happens when something deep within connects with something deep without. He is also naming the sign of the authenticity of that connection, which is joy. What happened in January is this dynamic: a covenantal relationship between partners that resulted in people in need, in great need, receiving what they needed. And the result was deep joy on all sides. Amazing things happen at the border when one stops and waits and listens to the voice of God and to the voices of each other. May we continue to be a people who listen well at the border, whatever the border of our lives is right now, so that we too make good decisions about our land and its future. Amen.